Hello, welcome to the EPG Pathshala on Linguistics. I am Dr. Reenu Punus, affiliated to the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. I will now be taking you through the module titled Issues in Experimental Phonetics. In the last unit, we looked at the various methods that are used in all the three branches of experimental phonetics, namely articulatory, acoustic, and auditory phonetics. Research in the last century has greatly advanced our knowledge of how speech is produced, transmitted, and perceived. Several important questions and issues have also been raised regarding the methodologies adopted and the nature of the research objectives. In this unit, some of these important issues that research in experimental phonetics has raised will be discussed. The first issue that we will be talking about is the issue of unnatural data. By and large, the dominant methodological tradition in experimental phonetics has involved recording participants in heavily controlled environments. Tasks frequently involve eliciting randomized word lists and use of artificial materials like nonsense words that match the phonological patterning of the language under investigation. Experimental phonetics has generally been concerned with citation forms and with language varieties which are largely agreed upon to be standard. Data are usually collected from relatively small, homogeneous groups, unstructured groups of speakers speaking in isolation and recorded in ideal acoustic conditions. There are two main advantages to using this method. Firstly, the heavy control exercised over recording conditions and the type of tasks elicited from participants. This has the advantage of facilitating inter-speaker, intercontextual and cross-linguistic comparisons. Secondly, certain phonetic data are much easier to measure and analyze in such conditions. For example, duration studies that focus on voice onset time or VOT or vowel length would prove tremendously difficult to measure or analyze on uncontrolled data due to the effects of phonological context and overall speech rate. While the conventional methodology of experimental phonetics can be useful in many ways, it is not without its limitations. It has come under much criticism for lacking severely in naturalness. Pronunciations of elicited citation forms or word lists cannot be seen as equivalent of the kind of language spoken by users in an everyday setting or on a regular basis. Moreover, such artificial means of data collection only reflect the surface of the speaker's phonetic repertoire and therefore offer only a limited scope for theoretical predictions to be made with regard to phonological knowledge. Some creative ways in which the artificiality of conventional experimental methods in phonetics have been dealt with include replacing the word lists with picture naming tasks in which participants are shown pictures and asked by the researcher to name the object or action or event shown in the picture. Map tasks are another way in which this issue is dealt with. This involves the participants being given a map and asked to provide oral directions based on the map. Or spot the difference tasks in which two nearly identical pictures with a set number of differences are presented to the participants and they are asked to reveal the differences in both orally. The second issue that we will be talking about is accounting for variation. Language, as we know, varies. Interspeaker and intraspeaker variation are commonly observed. Variation may be attributed to differences in gender, class, age, region, ethnicity, linguistic and/or social context, etc. An overwhelming amount of research in sociolinguistics has shown that spontaneous speech and informal speech significantly differ from careful speech or formal speech. Conventional data collection methods in experimental phonetics has and to a large extent still continues to revolve around data in the form of randomized word lists, citation forms, short phrases and/or reading passages read aloud rather than natural speech on everyday topics. Through collection of data from homogeneous subjects in minimal style settings, possible sources of variation are suppressed in such a method. Instead, using a structured, heterogeneous group of speakers or participants and examining the inter-subject differences in phonetic features related to one or more social factors can enable us to understand both the common and the varying aspects of closely related systems. Language variation is the norm and not the exception, and therefore a theory that predicts the linguistic patterns found in everyday speech will be unsatisfactory until it accounts for patterns of language variation and change. A comprehensive linguistic theory must account for patterns of variation and change found in everyday speech. The third issue that we will be addressing is the influence of labels and categories. In phonetics, the smallest unit of sound is called a phoneme. As you will have learned in the introductory modules on phonetics and phonology, a phoneme is not meaningful by itself, but causes a change of meaning within a language. In other words, it is the smallest meaningful contrastive unit in the phonology of a language. Phonemes can be further classified into vowels and consonants. Some would advocate an even finer classification in the form of vowels, semi-vowels, and consonants based on the degree of stricture or closure of the vocal tract. Vowels can then be further divided based on lip rounding, tongue backing, and tongue height into rounded, unrounded, front, back, and high-low respectively. Consonants can be further divided into subgroups based on their manner of articulation, place of articulation, and voicing. Phonemes that have characteristics of both vowels and consonants are termed semivowels, and these are divided into two subgroups of liquids and glides. These labels and categories tend to act as a reference point on which to base more sophisticated observations of speech production and perception. The alphabet of the International Phonetic Alphabet is a reference system based on voicing, place of articulation, and manner of articulation for all possible vocal tract configurations that has provided a common ground using which phonetic parameters can be compared across languages. While it is extremely convenient to think of sounds and speech in terms of discrete units and categories with exclusive labels, it is worth noting that in reality, speech is not merely stringing together several discrete units to form a meaningful whole. Instead, speech constitutes continuously varying phonetic and other linguistic and extra-linguistic parameters. Such conventional categories and labels are well-established ways of temporarily segmenting dynamic phonetic parameters. They can, however, be the cause of preconceived notions for a linguist examining the subtle phonetic processes reflecting the phonological system of a language and those underlying significant language contrasts. For example, let us consider the concepts of primary and secondary articulation. The production of sounds may involve more than one type of stricture or closure. An apico-alveolar stop, for example, involves the tongue tip but leaves the tongue back and lips free for some degree of movement. One possibility in that case is for the tongue front to be raised towards the hard palate while holding the tongue tip constriction intact. In such an articulation, the tongue tip closure is regarded as the primary articulation, and the front of the tongue raising towards the hard palate is called the secondary articulation, and in this particular case is an example of palatalization, which is essentially the raising of the front of the tongue towards the hard palate, like in the articulation of the palatal approximant ear. It has been shown by several researchers that what is secondary in the degree of stricture may have primary importance in signaling contrasts between sounds in languages. Speakers of languages as diverse as English, Albanian, and Malayalam have been found to use perceptually salient effects of secondary articulation as a strategy or cue to strongly distinguish between otherwise nearly similar sounds in their inventories. Approaching the phonetic analysis of such cases only by examining differences between sounds along the dimensions of place, manner of articulation, and voicing may fail to reveal the subtle yet powerful strategies speakers and listeners use to distinguish contrastive sounds. Taking a more holistic approach to the description and examination of sounds and their properties will therefore enable a comprehensive in-depth understanding of the actual processes that underlie the mechanisms of speech. The fourth issue that we will be looking at is moving beyond segments. It is a well-known fact that we know a lot more about segmental phonetics than we do about suprasegmental phonetics. Segmental phonetics refers to the approach to phonetics which focuses on individual sounds or segments of speech, while suprasegmental phonetics takes into account features of speech bigger and beyond the segment. That is, for example, syllable, tone, rhythm, etc. In many of the world's languages, the effects of some phonetic processes like nasalization and secondary articulation are known to spread across more than one segment, sometimes even beyond the syllable in which these processes originated. In other words, these processes not only spread locally but could have wide domain effects on speech utterances. Such instances, therefore, also argue in favor of looking beyond a merely segmental approach. The fifth issue that we will be looking at is the location of measurements in acoustic data. Experimental phonetic studies typically involve large amounts of data from individual subjects, which in recent times has resulted in the use of automated measurements of relevant aspects of signal information like form and frequencies, intensity, F0, duration, etc. These measurements are extracted by automated scripts run in softwares like Praat. While these have greatly reduced the time taken to obtain the desired measurements of large amounts of data, it is worth noting that these automated scripts tend to be run on segmented Praat files, and depending on the segmentation criteria used, the location of measurement points as well as their values may vary significantly. Also, these automated scripts are not error-free in their extraction of the desired measurements and could often involve manual verification of the measurements by observing the spectrograms. Consider the following spectrogram of the Malayalam word param, which means banana. R is a post-alveolar approximant in Malayalam, and in this word is flanked by the vowel a on either side. Approximants, because of their vowel-like form and structure, are especially difficult to segment. If one were to use the drop in energy in the higher formants as an indicator, which can be seen in the figure as white spaces in the top middle portion of the spectrogram, then the segment boundaries would be at the points where the horizontal arrow 1 begins and ends. If the drop in energy in the lower formants, especially the first two formants, is to be taken into account, then the segment would have segment boundaries at the points at which the horizontal arrow 2 begins and ends in the figure on the screen. That is, the portion between the bold vertical lines. There is no absolute right or wrong way in such cases to mark the segmental boundaries. What is more important is for the researcher or student to be consistent across his or her data set in terms of the criteria used to segment particular speech sounds. Note that measures like duration are directly affected by such a difference in segmentation. Also, formant measurements at the onset, that is, the beginning of a segment, midpoint, and offset of a segment, which is the end of a segment, could vary depending on the differences in the location of measurement identified. The next issue that we will be talking about is the over-reliance on instruments. Experimental phonetics, by definition, is instrumental phonetics. It is a well-attested fact that technological advancement in the field of speech science has contributed immensely to our knowledge and understanding of how speech is produced, transmitted, and perceived. In the previous introductory unit on experimental phonetics, we also saw how the use of instrumental analysis redefined phonetics as a scientific discipline. However, exclusive use of instrumental analysis without concurrent impressionistic analysis would provide an incomplete picture of the processes in speech. While auditory analysis has been referred to as a coarser or rougher form of analysis in comparison to acoustic analysis, it is nevertheless faster to conduct and relies on the best perceptual filtering mechanism available, namely the human ear and auditory system. Undoubtedly, auditory analysis is prone to human error and subjectivity, but the same can be said about acoustic analysis. The choice of recording equipment, the software used, analysis settings, measurement criteria, and the location of measurement, the segmentation of speech, and the criteria used to segment therein all affect the acoustic data obtained. The differences in findings that arise from differences in these choices may be extremely significant. One of the requisite skills for a phonetician is the ability to make detailed auditory observations of speech. Two basic skills taught to students of phonetics are ear training and transcription. Ear training involves learning to carefully listen to and identify the phonetic and any other extra-linguistic characteristics of the slice of speech under investigation. Transcription involves describing the linguistic units in IPA notation. A thorough phonetic study must involve an initial impressionistic or auditory analysis of the data using the investigator's ear as one of the tools and a narrow IPA transcription of the data. This could then be followed by yet another round of transcriptions and analysis of data using instruments and speech software. Only listening to the data initially, without relying on its corresponding spectrogram, will help the researcher to focus only on what he or she hears rather than risk being influenced by what its acoustic signal predicts about its percept. Impressionistic analysis and acoustic analysis must therefore go hand in hand. Findings or observations from the auditory impressionistic analysis may not have a one-to-one correspondence with those from the acoustic analysis. For example, the acoustic correlates of the auditory percept of a rhotic, otherwise known as R sounds, are still unclear in the literature. The definition of what constitutes a rhotic phonetically is also murky. It is unclear what common physical properties their signals carry that creates a perception of similarity amongst the R sounds across the world's languages with respect to belonging to the same family of sounds. The last issue that we will be addressing in this module is the lack of invariance. The lack of invariance is one of the central issues in phonetics, and it refers to the lack of a one-to-one correspondence between the perceptual categories and the acoustic characteristics of speech sounds. For example, the vowel a based on the cardinal vowel system, is defined as a front, open, unrounded vowel. We also know that the cardinal vowel system is a system of reference vowels against which we can compare the actual vowels found in the world's languages. The general acoustic features of the vowel are, based on the front open unrounded label, are as follows: a high F1, a low F2. This, however, cannot be taken to mean that in reality, every R vowel in every speech utterance will show the same average values of F1, F2 frequencies. Take, for example, the words part and cart. R before or after a front sound like P would naturally sound fronter than R before or after a back sound like K. And the F1, F2 frequencies of R in part are likely to be significantly different from those of R in cart. The same sound can therefore exhibit significantly different acoustic characteristics based on its linguistic environment. Just like the same sound with respect to category can have different acoustic properties depending on linguistic environment, the same acoustic property may be indicative of two different perceptual categories. 2. For example, a lowered third formant is often claimed in the literature as being a characteristic acoustic indicator of rhoticity. But it is also an indicator of roundedness and retroflexion in various languages of the world. Also, there is now sufficient evidence in the literature on several languages that reveal that all rhotics in all of the world's languages are not characterized by a low third formant. The lack of invariance issue in phonetics clearly shows that even though the three broad processes that underlie speech, namely speech production, transmission, and perception, are undoubtedly interlinked, the relationship among these three aspects is not fixed but relational and, at least to some extent, language specific. To summarize then, in this module, we have looked at several issues in experimental phonetics that those of us learning, teaching, and researching phonetics need to take into account in our attempts to understand the various interlinked processes that characterize speech production, transmission, and perception. We discussed how the data collected in studies that fall under the label of experimental phonetics tend to largely involve citation forms elicited in artificial settings, for example, in laboratory conditions. The variation that is inherent in language is also not dealt with in conventional experimental phonetics, which in turn raises questions regarding the applicability of the findings of such studies to real-life speech situations. While the use of labels and categories to describe phonetic elements and processes are convenient ways to decode and understand how speech is produced, transmitted, and perceived, we looked at how certain labels can be misleading or lead to preconceived notions about the scope and significance of a particular phonetic process or aspect of speech. We also touched upon the fact that segmental phonetics has been the subject of far more research in experimental phonetics than non-segmental or suprasegmental phonetics, and that a segmental approach is limited in its scope with respect to explaining certain speech parameters, speech processes like nasalization and resonance or secondary articulation. The over-dependence on instruments and their accuracy in experimental phonetics and the need for an integrated use of both auditory or impressionistic analysis and instrumental analysis for a more comprehensive picture of speech processes was also discussed. The subjectivity involved in the researcher's analysis of acoustic features vis-à-vis the location of measurements, segmental boundaries, etc. was also pointed out to show that the use of instruments does not automatically guarantee objectivity and error-free findings. Lastly, a central problem in phonetics, namely the lack of one-to-one correspondence between the perceptual categories and the acoustic features of speech sounds, known as the lack of invariance, was also discussed. Thank you. We have reached the end of the module titled Issues in Experimental Phonetics. I hope that the concepts have been clear. For further information, please visit the EPG Pathshala website. Thank you for your time.